Philip Gulley is a minister, a pastor. He is a Quaker minister. He's gotten himself in trouble for some of the things that he writes about and some of the things he suggests, which, as I've said before, makes me like him all the more. And so today I want to share with you some of his ideas, some of my ideas about authentic spirituality. The song that Shana just shared with us, Spirit in Me, as I was listening to it again, I was thinking it's like a prayer. It's like what I want to feel and experience in my life. And to me, that is authentic spirituality. Being in a church, being in a sangha, being in a community, being in a teaching can certainly help me understand how to get there, maybe, can certainly support me in learning how to be like that. But ultimately, it's a very personal and very individual journey. Religion, not so much so, but spirituality, I think, very much so. I thought it was interesting, too, and quite a coincidence again. Yesterday morning, I received in my email box an article from Progressive Christianity. It's a blog that I subscribe to. I like to pay attention to what's happening in that field. And here is a leading quote from yesterday's article, a quote from Zach Lambert. The vast majority of people walking away from Christianity in America are not rejecting the person and work of Jesus. They are rejecting faulty biblical interpretations that lead to bigotry, oppression, and marginalization. This rejection isn't unchristian, it is Christ-like. Yeah. I also shared with you a couple of weeks ago, I think, a struggle that's going on within our larger unity movement. We have two organizations in unity. We have our unity ministers, Unity World Ministers, and we have Unity World Headquarters. The ministers organization is all about ministers and ministries, and it is, of the two organizations, the smaller organization. The Unity Center is part of UWM, but we are also part of the whole movement of unity, which is very much Unity World Headquarters. And part of the conversation that's going on, especially in light of what's happening in our country over the last couple of years around Christian nationalism, is this real question, is unity Christian or not? And actually, it's something we've struggled with for a long time. If you do a deep dive search on unity, you will find all sorts of ways that we are described, from things to be afraid of, that we are a cult. I can't imagine why anybody would think that. There's no controlling and no fear and manipulation that goes on in unity, to absolutely, we are not at all Christian, we are anti-Christ. And I guess it really depends on how you look at what Christianity is. Is Christianity the church, or is Christianity a spiritual path and teaching that Jesus left us with? Remember, the original followers of Jesus were not called Christians. It wasn't a term he used. They were called, do you remember what they were called? Followers of the way. Followers of the way, a way of being, a way of living. So in our unity movement, there is this big question: how do we identify ourselves, especially since there is such a wide range of how people look at Christianity today? Christian nationalism, to me, is something that Jesus himself, if he were here now, would have no part of. And so, yes, we almost can't help but have our cultural roots in Christianity, because America, by and large, has come out of a Judeo-Christian culture. But that doesn't mean that we look at Christianity when we look at it in the same way that a fundamentalist would or the religious right would. And that's why we have this struggle. And you may have it too. If you have family members who discover that you are part of unity, and if they are very literal in their understanding of Christianity, they may really wonder and question, are you Christian? Have you had that happen, some of you? Yeah. And so I don't know that there's an easy answer to the question, but to me, whether we are or we aren't is immaterial. What matters is, how do we live our lives? Whether it is that we are more aware of the precepts and the teachings of Jesus as a teacher, how is that impacting the way we live? Or if we align more or feel more at home, say with the teachings of the Buddha or of Lao Tzu, how does that inform and shape the way that we live? It is my deeply held belief that these teachers of consciousness would care less about what we call ourselves, but would care very deeply about how we are living, how we are treating one another, how we are caring for and about one another. Does that make sense? Right? So it's not a simple answer, but maybe the answer doesn't really matter, because maybe what really matters is how are we being, how are we living? So Philip Gulley suggests this: if the church were Christian, encouraging personal exploration would be more important than communal uniformity. If the church were more Christian, encouraging personal exploration would be more important than communal uniformity. I call the idea of personal exploration the freedom to pursue one's authentic spirituality. And a safe community is, I think, one of the best places to be able to do that, to really explore one's relationship with this other, with spirit, with the divine, whatever name we want to put to that. But I've heard too many stories from people in our community about how they have been shunned or shamed or ostracized in other churches or other places where they have dared to explore, when they have dared to ask some of the deeper probing questions. And what amazes me when I hear these stories from some of you in this community, or you write to me about some of these stories, is that yet you have not thrown the baby out with the bathwater, that you are here. And to me, that must take great courage to step back in if you were shamed or shunned for having the audacity to ask a legitimate question. A legitimate question. In some churches, the teaching is so strict and rigid that there are severe consequences for breaking them. In Jehovah's Witness, it's called disfellowshipping. That doesn't sound very loving, does it? In the Catholic Church, it's called excommunication. That doesn't sound very warm and fuzzy either. The Quakers call it being read out of meetings. And the Amish, this one actually kind of surprised me. It's shunning. There's a shaming energy in all of that. Would you not agree? Would you not agree? And I find myself wondering, is there no room for forgiveness? Where is the room for tolerance? Where is the room for understanding? Where is the room for compassion? Especially since the ones I've mentioned here, Jehovah's Witness, Catholic Church, Quakers, Amish, and I'm sure there are others, are built around this person, Jesus' teachings. And yet he talked about love, didn't he? He talked about they're going to know that you are my disciples, meaning my followers, by how well you love each other, by how well you love each other. He didn't talk about making the whole world believe as he believed. He said, when you go into a town, he sent his disciples out 2 by 2 to share what it was. At least that's what we're told in the Gospels. He sent them out 2 by 2 to share some of his teaching, some of his ideas. But he said to them, when you go, if you are not received, shake the dust off your sandals and leave. He didn't say dig your heels in and try to convert them. He didn't say shame them. He didn't say shun them. He just said, shake the dust off your sandals. That's a pretty gentle thing, right? He didn't say throw the sandal. Just shake the dust off your sandals and leave. And to me, that's powerful. It's like, don't be afraid to share what it is that I have shared with you that you must resonate with because you're with me. Don't be afraid to share it. And I say that to us, that we ought not to be afraid or reluctant to speak about what it is that we think and believe spiritually, to be willing to be vulnerable and courageous enough to share it, but to also not be attached to the results of it. To know that it may land on fertile soil, and you may have someone that says, gosh, I'd like to know more about that. Tell me a little bit more. Or, gosh, I see the way your life seems to be working, or the way you seem to be able to handle yourself in tough situations. I'd like to know a little bit more about how you're wired, how you're able to do that. That could be a response, or the response may simply be, no, not interested, don't believe in any of that stuff, or I have my own beliefs. And then you just shake the dust off your sandals and you leave. It doesn't mean you have to even leave the relationship. It just means that you decide you've done what maybe you came to do, which is to share, but not to be attached to it. So this trauma that I think has happened to many in church, I think, at least for somebody who is very much a part of church or spiritual community, is heartbreaking to me. Gully writes about communal uniformity like this. He says, time and again, when faced with the choice between oppressive conformity and personal exploration, the church has opted for uniformity. Pause there for a moment. Why do you think the church would opt for uniformity rather than personal exploration? Power. Power. It's much easier to control you if you're all doing what I tell you to do as the authority, right? But if you're encouraged to explore, to try to understand spirit in you, that is challenging or can be challenging. So time and again, when faced with the choice between oppressive conformity and personal exploration, the church has opted for uniformity. The consequences of this tendency are so dramatic as to be breathtaking. Today, the church is hemorrhaging members as more and more thoughtful people look outside the church for enlightenment. I want to stop there too. Looking outside the church for enlightenment, looking outside the community for enlightenment, looking outside the very thing that ought to be encouraging every step of personal exploration that might end or result in enlightenment, that people are leaving to pursue that. What it says to me is there's still that deep interest in our souls for spiritual awakening. Do you sense that there is? A deep desire for understanding the bigger questions and feeling a connection with whatever we want to call that, something that is infinite and eternal and is the very ground of being, to have some sort of understanding of that and some sort of relationship with and to that. He continues, efforts to stem this fight are usually inwardly the same, wedded to a worldview many have found unhelpful in their search for meaning. I think a lot of what is in the church is unhelpful, offering a worldview that's unhelpful. He says, though more and more people seem interested in spirituality, they look less and less to the church as a setting for their search. Wow. Wow, we're sending them somewhere else instead of encouraging. And then he poses these questions, and I think these are great questions, but I have a bias toward questions. I think questions are really, really important. He says, what if the church began to understand itself as a seedbed of inquiry? What if the church began to understand itself as a seedbed of inquiry, as a place where persons could gather to consider what it means to be human? What if the church understood itself less as a conveyor of an unchangeable truth and more as a community of seekers eager to think, grow, and explore? That's the kind of church I want to be involved in. That's what I think we have here. It's what I think we have in New Thought. Not a conveyor of unchangeable truth, but a community of seekers. That's the highest praise I think a minister or a community could receive, is that its members look at themselves as seekers, as spiritual seekers, seeking to have an authentic spirituality, seeking to have an authentic relationship with the divine, with God, with Spirit, whatever name is acceptable to you for that. I believe Jesus stood for this. Jesus challenged the religious rigidity of his day. It's in part what got him crucified. Thank God you can challenge it, and that's not going to happen to you. It's not going to happen to you. One of the most powerful and poignant places that he does this is in what is called the Sermon on the Mount. And if you've never read it, I encourage you to. It's in the Gospel of Matthew. The Sermon on the Mount, depending upon where you want to start it could start at the 5th chapter of Matthew or the 6th. But in it, he gives the beautiful Beatitudes, which we could just stop there. It's like the contrast to the Old Testament 10 Commandments, which are all about thou shalt not do this, this, and this, very rigid, very black and white, to Jesus' Beatitudes, which are all about ways of being. That's what Beatitude stands for, ways of being. He gives that teaching. Then he also goes on to give another nuanced teaching where he is contrasting the old way of the religion, the old Mosaic law, to what he believes, I'm going to use my words, would be the evolutionary thread of that teaching. It is where he draws sharp contrast about topics such as murder, adultery, divorce, oaths, eye for an eye, and one's enemies. And what he does in this section of his sermon, scholars say he didn't really stand on a mount and he didn't give all this at once and it wasn't laid out like this beautiful PowerPoint, but whatever. He gives these very specific examples that his followers would understand from their religious tradition and says, you have heard it said of old, blah, 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 about these things, about murder, about adultery, and so forth. And then he contrasts each and every one of them. And he says, but I say to you. And in each case of him saying, but I say to you, he is actually giving a more evolved understanding of the idea. He's giving a higher practice, I think, spiritually of the concept and the idea. And as I was looking at this yesterday, I was thinking to myself, I wonder what would be on his list today. I wonder if he were to stand here today and have a national platform, what would be on his list where he'd be saying basically now, not of the temple and of Judaism, he'd be saying of Christianity, you have heard it said in Christian churches, blah, 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 but I say to you this. Do you think there would be an evolution? Oh, I absolutely think there would be an evolution. I think it could lead to a revolution. That he would be talking about the very real issues that are dividing people and causing, or at least contributing, to so much pain and suffering and inequality and injustice. And I think he would be saying, this is what you thought I meant, but this is what I do mean. It would be the difference between Pauline doctrine, which is Paul, the Apostle Paul's interpretation of Jesus' teachings, be the difference between that or the difference between churchianity and true mystical spiritual Christianity. World of difference. One, I believe, really does encourage us and want us to develop an authentic spirituality, to have an authentic relationship with God, to have an authentic relationship with the divine. How do we do that? I don't think it's all that difficult, really. I think some of the things we do to have that is we expose ourselves to a variety of spiritual teachings, and we take a somewhat deep dive into them to try to understand them a bit. And then we begin to really, as we explore, and maybe most of you have already done this, we check in with ourselves. What makes sense to our minds? What makes sense to our heart and our soul? Where do we resonate? Where does it seem as if, almost on a cellular level, our body says a holy yes to that? And then we trust that. And then we stop jumping around like it's a buffet, and we kind of stay with whatever that is. It could be unity, but it may not be for you. But whatever that is, then we stay with that. And we really go as deep into that as we possibly can. His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about this somewhat. He says, if you're going to be Buddhist, be the best Buddhist you can be. If you're Christian, be the best Christian you can be. Not on the superficial level, but on the level of the teaching of being able to embody whatever that is, to trust our own soul's resonance with the teaching, and I say with community. From Buddhism, I agree that Sangha is important, community is important. It's not everything, but it's important to be connected with others that are of similar mind and heart, that can strengthen you in your journey, and where you can be part of the strengthening and the support of others in their journey. It doesn't have to be that difficult, but it does involve paying attention and trusting ourselves. I'm reminded of something I heard from this platform less than 10 days ago from Krishna Das, when he was here on Tuesday evening giving his workshop. There was something he said that I started to scribble down because it was very important to me. It really spoke to me. He was teaching about the idea of trusting your experiences. Trusting your experiences more than anything else. Don't just take it on somebody else's say-so. Trust your experiences. And what he said that was powerful to me was, if you don't trust yourself, if you don't trust your own experience of what has happened, if you don't trust that, you have no place to rest. That was powerful to me, because I know that in those many of the times in my life when I have not trusted myself, it's exhausting. It's as if my soul has no place to find comfort, peace, and rest. I think this is a part of developing an authentic spiritual practice and an authentic spiritual life. Just a few more thoughts very quickly here. Gully also says, if the church were Christian, meeting needs would be more important than maintaining institutions. Meeting needs would be more important than maintaining institutions. Jesus and the Buddha were smart enough not to build buildings. Believe me, I love what we have. It is a beautiful facility. And we are rethinking it in so many different ways. We've had to, as has every church that I'm knowledgeable about, or every article about churches that I've been reading, coming out of a post-pandemic, post-COVID world. Spiritual communities all over the world are looking at the spaces that they built that once served a very specific purpose, and that now saying, now how do we utilize what we have to leverage the greatest good? And we and our board have been deep in that conversation for quite a while, certainly coming out of the pandemic. And, you know, I look at, and I kind of chuckle to myself, yeah, Jesus and Buddha were really smart. They didn't build it, right? They didn't build it. They had a teaching, and if people resonated with it, they followed, and they took root in the teaching, but then those followers built things, right? And then when you build it, there's maintenance and all of that. Gully points out in his book about one of his ministerial colleagues who had stepped into a very successful church, and the church board was comprised of very high-level business people, and it was running at absolute efficiency. But the minister wasn't too happy because he was asking himself, to what end? What are we really serving? How are we really making a difference? And so this particular minister decided to shake things up a bit. What I know is whenever you change anything in a church, all hell breaks loose. Some of it goes underground, some of it goes above ground, some of it goes sideways, but it's just part of what happens. But anyway, this minister decided to kind of throw a monkey wrench in things. And when a couple of board members' terms were expiring, he brought onto the board a nurse and a school teacher, and I forget somebody else, and they were all women that he brought onto the board. And they were driving the business people nuts, because they wanted to open up, a preschool for underprivileged kids. They wanted to run a day camp. They had all of these ideas, and they started to implement them. And when the business people would say, and how are we going to pay for it? They'd say, God's going to give us the answer. And he said, and if you want to drive a bunch of business people crazy, tell them God's going to pay for it. God's going to provide the answer. But the point of it being that whatever it is that we have, and we can make it very personal to us, to our Unity Center and our ranch, it ought to be in service to making a positive difference in people's lives. It's why we broadcast. It's not inexpensive to broadcast, but a lot of our people now receive what we have to offer that makes their life work better on the other end of that camera. Some of us can be here in this room. Some of us can be out in the community. And so really, I think it comes down to leveraging everything that we are and do in service to being about making the world a better world. It's the both ends of our mission statement, transforming lives and healing our world. Unity used to be primarily focused on the first part. Unity has always been very keen on individual education, helping people learn basic unity principles and the tools and technologies of spiritual practice as understood by unity. And so the focus has always been on that. But over my lifetime now of being in ministry, I've seen us really evolve to what I think is a much more authentic spirituality, where we still care about the individual. We still want to equip and support one another in healing and transforming our individual lives, but we also deeply recognize and are committed to the reality that it can't end there. It can't end there. That authentic spirituality should not just end in enlightenment, but ought to end in, I guess, what is referred to in Buddhism as the bodhisattva energy of staying here and being here to do anything within our individual power to help create a better world. That sounds really big, doesn't it? Well, it sounds really big to me, maybe not to you, but it sounds really big. But when we break it down, when we look at our own authentic spiritual practice, and then we keep our eyes open and our hearts open to who and what shows up in our life, where we can somehow be of support and help and encouragement, then we're doing the work. Then we're doing the work. And with that, I leave you. Namaste.